Yes, thank you. Yeah, I have pleasure to be here, like I said, and I'm going to talk about ecological smart cities in India and also in the global south. So the next slide. I'll begin with something that many of you watching this might be familiar with, a nightlight satellite image of the world. And what I want to point out here is the rapid rate of urbanization. You'll see in many parts of the world, especially in the global south, India, China, uh, many parts of Africa, many parts of Latin America, apart from the US and Europe, are increasingly becoming lit up by lights at night as the satellites capture, and that is really an indicator of urbanization. And we're already a world that is more than 50% urban, and the world is in the middle of a very rapid urban transition. So the era of the Anthropocene, which we all know about, is actually the era of the urban. And we are pouring so much cement and concrete into our cities. We're going to become a world that is 75% urban by 2050. But where are these new cities going to come from, or these new urban areas? The next slide. If you look at this map, for instance, of the growth of cities from 1990 to 2014, you will see that the red and the yellow cities, which is the fastest growing cities, are dominated by India, China, and interestingly enough, Nigeria being the third fastest urbanizing country in the world. And you will see the growth rates are 3 to 5% or more than 5%. And India, for instance, is really a hotspot of urban growth. We have 3 of the world's 10 largest cities, and we have 3 of the world's 10 fastest growing cities. And we also have many of the world's now top polluted cities in terms of air pollution. And no surprise, because of the rate at which it's growing, it's very difficult for infrastructure to keep pace with the demand in these kinds of global south contexts. The next slide. Next slide. Yeah, thanks. And so what happens is we get issues like a lot of informal settlements, and you can see the informal settlements in these tin shacks, because all these cities, whether it's you think of the city in Nigeria, so think of Kigali, think of Bangalore, think of Mumbai, think of the city in Latin America, city in Brazil, they're all basically growing not because it's a planned city with the urban infrastructure, but often because it's shanties of people like this, people moving in from rural areas which are not growing fast enough, where there is climate change hitting, you have a lot of climate refugees. They come in and they live in these very bad conditions, and they are faced with heat island effects, flooding, water pollution, air pollution. And typically the poor are the worst affected because they are the ones which are most marginalized, most exposed to these kinds of infrastructure. And you'll see that nature has a role to play in all of these, because there are no trees, there are heat island effects. Because there are no wetlands, there is flooding. Because we haven't put in the waterways, and we've encroached in all the waterways, and we are throwing in a lot of detergent, you have water pollution. And of course, we have cars which leading to air pollution, and we've not managed our public transport adequately, in which case we would have left trees on the road. The next slide. So if you look at India, it's not just the fact that urbanization is impacting the quality of life in cities, but it's also the fact that its urbanization is a huge impact on the rural landscape around it. So if you think of India in the next 50 years, we're going to be, by 2050, in the next 25 years, we're going to add 400 million urban people. 3 cities alone, in India, the Kolkata, Mumbai, and Delhi will contain more than 100 million people, just those 3 cities within themselves, right? We have done some recent analysis which show that protected areas, 3 times the number of protected areas are going to, than there were 20 years ago, are coming within 50 kilometers of cities. Which means if you have a city right next to a protected area, the city is going to hugely impact the protected area. Our cities are also sucking water from rivers like Kaveri, Ganga, and Yamuna, which means they're drying out and running out of water. They have a rising electricity demand, a rising infrastructure demand, which means more roads, more highways, more buildings, which adds to the impact on nature, not just within the city, but outside the city. And cities, of course, not just suck in waste and suck in water and electricity and food, but they also export a lot of waste and pollution. So unless we think of sustainable cities, we are not going to think of sustainable countries. And that those two are very strongly interlinked, especially in a globalizing world. The next slide. Cities can't survive if they ignore ecology, and nor can India or any global south country which is urbanizing maintain rural well-being unless they actually address urban sustainability. Right? The next slide. So we started with some originally looking at actually some literature on sustainable global south cities. And what we found was global south cities have been growing very fast. For instance, Bangalore, if you look at, it's the conventional story is the market town, which was in 1537 to the tiny polygon, but the ecological history is much older. But also what I want to tell you is we've been working on Bangalore for the past, from 2006 onwards. And we have now a lot of data and papers, about 70 or 80 publications in the different aspects of Bangalore. So I'm going to use Bangalore as a case study. But really, we've been working on Delhi, Mumbai, Kolkata, so many other cities in India. And the story is not very different there. And the story is not different for other global south cities. However, we did do an analysis some while ago. And when we were looking at that, we were, I think we missed some slides. Can you just go back? One slide back? Oh, okay, never mind. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, yeah, you can skip ahead. So this is from the book Nature in the City, where I'm going to talk about the ecological history of Bangalore. And yeah, you could move ahead. But one of the things we've been seeing is, if you look at the top 1,000 papers in ecological sustainability and in urban sustainability, and we did that analysis in a nature sustainability paper, what you find is that in these cities, essentially, the top maybe 0.5% comes from global south. So if you look at the top cited 1,000 papers over a decade of work on urban sustainability, only 0.5% comes from the global south. 20% comes from China, which is a context of its own. And the remaining 70% comes from the US and Europe. It's a very little that we have, which is context specific, which is relevant to these countries. And therefore, one of the reasons we started all this work is to get some information on how do you actually think of urban sustainability. And there's been a lot of focus on smart cities, but many of these, what we've seen is these cities are so infrastructure poor and so lacking in basic money, because the pace of growth is outstripping the capacity of the cities to provision. They will eventually catch up, but in the meantime, you don't have the capacity, for instance, sewage lines or road infrastructure, or dealing with air pollution, or dealing with public transport. And therefore, what happens is, in a city that is not wired, where many people lack education, many people lack the internet, many people lack basic facilities, you can't have a smart city. What you can have, which fits the Indian ethos very well, or the global south ethos, I would argue, even moving wider than India, is the idea of an ecologically smart city, where you can, because nature is acting as infrastructure. Nature cleans up our water, nature cleans up our air, nature provides people with food. And so through the example of Bangalore, I'm going to talk to you about how we've always been an ecologically smart city, but we're losing that sort of concept of being ecologically smart. The next slide. So if you look at Bangalore, the general idea is that it became a market town in 1537, and this area was barren before that. But it was not barren. It's an unusual old city. It is, we always think of cities as growing in the, as civilizations, ancient civilizations growing next to water, but Bangalore is in the rainshade of the Western Ghats. It gets very little rain. It's a semi-arid area, and there were no perennial sources of water. And yet we have megalithic stone tombs that tell us people were there 2,500, 3,000 years ago. We don't know about those people who are there. They have left a few megalithic stone tombs and other traces, menhirs and other traces of their existence. We also find around the turn between BC and AD a lot of different amphoras of coins, including Roman coins and coins from different parts of the world, which hint at the fact that Bangalore may have been an overland trade center. But again, we don't know anything about how these people lived ecologically. However, from about the 6th century onwards, we start finding stone inscriptions and copper plate inscriptions that give you a sense of how people lived in this landscape, because it's the first written record. And the black is a boundary of Bangalore, of the current municipality boundaries, and overlaid on a digital elevation model. And you can see how undulating the terrain of Bangalore is. So the red is the flat ground, which is where the national park is even now. And you can see that the east of Bangalore is relatively flat, and the west is quite undulating. In fact, they were two ecologically different terrains with biogeographically different terrains. What you have is a watershed, and the hills that you see in the center divide the western part. So in the west, the rainfall actually flows into a river, which is the Kaveri River, which is a tributary of the Kaveri River. And in the east, it flows into a tributary of a different river called the Pen River. Okay, so these are two completely different watersheds. You also find that people initially, when they came in between the 6th and 9th centuries, came in mostly to the east. and mostly towards the shallow areas. And that makes sense because they're flat and they're relatively easy to do agriculture. So you would actually come in here, create a lake or a water body, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, and dig into this depression. So it's a tank, it's a holding tank for water. It holds the rainfall, and that is what makes it an ecologically sustainable place so that you can actually expand human cultivation in this area. The west is far rockier and it stays, even in the west, you'll see that people are going into the shallow slopes, and that's where they're actually building. The next slide. By the 10th and 12th centuries, the good landscapes have been taken over, so people start moving a little more into the hilly areas, but they're still moving into low elevation areas. You can see largely wherever you see the locations of the inscriptions, they're not in the really rocky terrain. The next slide. By the time of the 13th and 14th centuries, the Hoysala dynasty takes over. The Hoysala dynasty are very strong tank builders. And they build these tanks of water. So in fact, if you look at the very first inscription, which is Honga Sandra, the epithet Sandra is a corruption of the Sanskrit word Samudra, which means large body of water. We think of Samudra as sea, but actually what Samudra means is a large body of water, which tells you that there was a lake. Honga Sandra, there is absolutely no lake now. You see all of these village points now spread across the landscape by the 13th to 14th centuries. But what you will see is, and you will see many more, 16th is Belur Nagasandra, 19 is Mallasandra, 20 is Singasandra, 21 is Suli Kunte. Kunte is a smaller body of water. 23 is Dodda Nekundi. Nekundi is a intermediate body of water. So there were large, medium, small bodies of water, but they were all networked hydrologically because Bangalore is hilly terrain. And what you had is, again, this was something that the Cholas before them and the Hoysalas after these are different dynasties did very well, which is to interlink these networks of reservoirs. So a reservoir that was at a higher elevation, when it got rainfall, would overflow through a sluice gate, and that water would be used for agriculture and cultivation of orchards, as well as it would be diverted down a rainwater channel into the next lake, and then the next lake, and then the next lake. So eventually it would flow out of the city, but it would really recharge a number of different lakes along the way. So no drops of water would be wasted. And there was a lot of rainwater harvesting. And when this water went into the ground, there was a well on the left side and a well on the right side that were then used through the year. And so it's not just the landscape. The lakes were shallow, they dried up, they were desilted. The silt was used, fertile silt was used for agriculture. There were fish that thrived in the silt-ridden, low, shallow water. People would walk in and pluck this fish out from the water and eat them. So that was their source of protein. And then when the lake dried completely in the summer, it was used for millet farming, as well as for, just weeds would grow. And these were weeds that people would pick up and either feed the cattle or they would cook with them themselves. Very nutritious weeds. So this entire lake landscape was a three-dimensional landscape of water and food and agriculture and shade, because there were a lot of trees that were around this entire area, right? So this was a very different kind of a landscape organized around its lakes. And this tells us how do people survive in a semi-arid landscape? By protecting and preserving every drop of water, by being very ecologically smart. The next slide. By the 14th to 16th centuries, these are the new villages, and you'll see now new villages come up in the hilly terrain because there's no other place, all the other good places are being taken. But villages are spread across this entire dynasty, across this entire landscape. And that village with its tank network and its agricultural network is what is helping these landscapes thrive by the time the market city is founded in 1537. The next slide. So this is the location of the inscriptions. We also get a lot of hints from the text of the inscriptions about how these landscapes function. And this is a very typical inscription from one of the villages, Kempapura of 1306. But this kind of inscription, which are marked in yellow, are repeated in inscription after inscription. So it's not unique to this landscape. And it talks about, it's a land grant essentially. They have created this village and created this lake. And they're talking about the village having all the agricultural produce that goes from this village to the god, to the temple. And therefore it's a land grant written. But look at the way they define the land grant. We grant with pouring of water because it's sacred as a devadana, that is a contribution to the god, Vileshwara Mudayar, for this village, the tank of the village, and all the wet and dry lands. And look at the three-dimensional imagination. When they talk about the wet and the dry lands, which is the paddy, the wetlands is the irrigated landscape of paddy, and the dry lands is the non-irrigated millets, including the wells underground and the trees overground within their four boundaries. So this is a very different landscape. I mean, think of any survey grant in any modern part of the world today. Who talks about the wells underground and the trees overground within the four boundaries as being part of a land grant or as being part of a survey document? Well, one of the first things, in fact, people do in a city is if you have a well, it's land wasted because you can't build. So across Indian cities, across many global south cities, first thing people do is they fill in the wells. In rural areas, people protect wells, but in cities, people fill in the wells because every square foot of land is valuable. Similarly, if you have a tree is an area where you can't build. So the first thing people would do is cut down the tree and build a house. And then try and figure out how you're going to have air conditioning later to deal with the heat wave. Right? So this three-dimensional landscape was there. It was ecological wisdom. It has disappeared from our lives. The next slide. On the other hand, this was the east. This is a very typical inscription that I told you about from the east. The hills or the Malnad, the landscape of the west, had a very different ecological structure. It was rocks, granite, very thin soil, very not good, not at all fertile. And the ecological use of that landscape was pastoralism. It was a jungle. It had thorny bushes, wild beasts. And the inscriptions are not at all talking about wetlands and drylands and wells. In fact, they talk about hunts. At Kengeri, one of them records the death of Ramadeva, who was killed by a wild boar. They're hero stones, really. From Kanakpura, another place, a death of another person from a tiger attack, of a second person from a tiger attack, and a third person and his dog. So they were hunting dogs who died in a boar hunt. So lots of wild boar and wild tiger attacks. Then there are hero stones describing cattle raids because there were different groups of people from different villages who had cattle. And they fought together, they fought with each other. They were actually cattle raids, but they were talked about as heroic battles. And the stones describe the victors, or in some cases, the people who died as going to heaven, and the opposite side as going down to hell. Right? So again, you get this very different ecological sense of this landscape. And even today, the jungles of the southwest of Bangalore, where these inscriptions are found, are areas of high biodiversity, especially high wildlife diversity, within the Bannerghatta National Park. The next slide. But today, this is Bangalore, and I was telling you about the valleys. The Vrishabhavati Valley is the valley that goes to the Kaveri River. The Hebbal and the Koramangala Chalagatta Valley feed into the Pen River, which goes into Tamil Nadu. So these are the two watersheds. This is very easy to see here. I mean that they're geologically different landscapes, but today builders and planners don't consider what was very obvious to Bangalore residents centuries ago. They don't know the difference between the west and the east, and a lot of it is because we have filled in the lakes of the west and filled in the wetlands and built up. So we've raised the landscape and raised the elevation on the east. In the west, we have blasted the rocks and reduced the elevation and again built on it. So we sort of flattened and tried to homogenize a landscape to the point that we've forgotten this ecological underpinnings. Yet, whenever you have environmental stress, for instance, when you have flooding, more flooding is always in the east. When you have drought, more drought is always in the west. And Bangalore is a very strange city which rains in one part of the city and doesn't rain in another part of the city. And the ecological difference really explains this, right? And it's very evident in times of flooding and drought. It's becoming increasingly evident in times of climate change, but it's not something that anybody has a popular imagination of. In fact, we didn't. Before I started the research, I didn't know this. Next slide. So this is the growth of Bangalore, and it's grown very rapidly. You can see almost every period in time, it kind of doubles in area, and the time period of doubling shrinks. So the city has been growing very, very fast. If you can go to the next slide. So I was talking about the inscription stones, and we know that from there, Kempegowda, who was the king who built the city, founded the modern city in 1537, the market city, not exactly a modern city, but a market city in 1537. We don't have any written notes on how the city was built. We have a lot of myths, but we don't know what was fact and what was myth. We have a lot of stories that survive about this is the way Kempegowda covered the city, but as an ecologist, one looks for facts that are written down somewhere. And there was Shivaji, very well-known king of Maharashtra, part of southern India. His father, Shaji, became the ruler of Bangalore for a brief time from 1638 to 1670. And his poet, Parmanand, wrote this poem called Shiva Bharat in 1670, which gives us a sense of how Bangalore looked like when Shaji took over in the 1640s. They call it Bingrul, and you can again see that it's an ecological city. It resounded with content coos of countless pigeons. It was animated by the calls of peafowl. The city teemed with deep lakes. Each house had a well. There were fountains at every square spouting a fine mist. There were home gardens and trees thick with flower and shade. The city was girdled by a bottomless moat shimmering with water and dotted with countless lakes. The Samudra metaphor comes back. Each lake was as big as a sea. Picturesque parks, festooned with creepers swinging gaily in the breeze, all adorned the city. And the king ruled here like the god Indra in his paradise, right? So it was an ecological paradise, and you can clearly see this. So we know that from, we have the villages which create this infrastructure for an ecologically smart city. The city comes on top of it. And clearly, Kempegowda and his dynasty preserve it till the point Shahaji takes over, because the city is still very beautiful. After that, we lose some information on it till, it changes a number. No, you can go. The next slide is right. A number of different rulers take over. But we don't, again, have a lot of information till there are a number of Anglo-Mysore wars. So the British come into this landscape, and Tipu Sultan, Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan, father and son, are rulers of this area. And they fight with the British. The third Anglo-Mysore war, Tipu loses, the Indian king Tipu loses Bangalore briefly to the British for 20 months, and they come and they sketch. So first thing the British do is draw sketches, paintings, and you get a sense of the landscape. And here you can see, I have put the boundaries of the cantonment and the Indian part of the city, but really when the British took over, all that you had was the Pete, that is the Indian part of the city, which is where people live, and the fort. So those two areas to the west. And then there was, the cantonment comes later. It's not there in 1791. I'm just giving you a sense of the geography. But you'll see a lot of lakes, and you will see that a lot of trees also planted either in squares, because these are orchards, or along roadsides in linear stretches. And you get a sense of this dry landscape, and I'll give you, if you can go to the next slide. Here's a painting. So you can see how this landscape looks. Because it's a semi-arid region, it's dry, it's open, it's barren, and you have the botanical garden Lal Bagh, and you can see it in the distance. That is the cypress gardens of Tipu, which later becomes the Lal Bagh Botanical Garden. But you also have barren stones, open areas, and a few trees planted on roadsides and in groves, and sacred trees like you have on these, these raised platforms. These are all sacred trees that are used for worship. The next slide. By 1888, the city has become a cantonment, become a British city, and the British find Bangalore very hot, so they plant trees. They have access to a palette of trees across the world, and so they plant all of these trees. They also build more and more lakes to provide the city with water. So the lakes are supplying the city, whose population has increased substantially. Now it becomes the a very major city under the British, and its population has increased substantially, and therefore they have to have a lot of these lakes to support people. But what happens in 1888 is the very last lake, which is Sankey Lake, is built, and Colonel Sankey, who builds the lake, says we've run out of place to create any more lakes. Now at this point, Bangalore faces a cusp in history. It could have decided to, the city decides it's running out of water, people are coming into the city, it needs to import some water from outside, and they start with importing water from the Arkavati Basin, which is the lake basin, which I showed you, which is on the western side. Now the cusp is, they were initially planning only to supplement the city's water supply, only for the Indian part of the city. So Bangalore has a very peculiar rule during the British time, during the colonial regime. It's partly cantonment ruled by the British commissioner. It's partly Indian city ruled by the Mysore king. So the Mysore king, who's extremely interested in new technology and is very progressive and very, very pro-modernization, decides to import this water through networks of pipes from the Arkavati Basin, which they will pump through. And the idea is only to bring it to certain parts of the city. But then the British asked for it to come to the cantonment part of the city too. And so instead of supplementing the city's water supply, which was local and sustainable, lakes were protected, they were desilted, there were local water goddesses, they were worshipped every year, they were maintained, they were considered sacred, pure, no trash was put in these lakes. Once they replaced the entire water supply with water from outside, within 3-4 years, you can see the language in the archive stage. No longer are these lakes cared for. Trash is dumped into them. They're called malarial cesspools. Even during the plague, people start dumping corpses into the lakes and wells. And which gives you a sense of the extent of defilement, because from the angle of sacred worship, no matter which religion you take in India, throwing a corpse into a water body is defiling it. making it non-pure. So you might clean it chemically with potassium permanganate and the like, but nobody will ever drink water from that well or use that water from that lake because it has been polluted, right? So the fact that you're throwing corpses into these areas during the time of plague, people wanted to hide corpses because if someone found a corpse and you identified it from the family would be taken away to the plague camp, which is in camp outside the city, and they were scared that the entire family would die. So to hide the corpses, they were throwing them into the lakes and wells. But this is not something they would have done, a few years before when they actually used the water from those areas. So the decline of these lakes started at this time. They continued to plant trees because the city was getting hotter and hotter as more people grew it. But I'll show you if you can go to the next slide. So this is the main street in Bangalore. The Indian part of the city had coconut trees, very useful trees, fruits and flowers and things that were used for worship, largely native. And if you go to the next slide, the British part of the city is largely exotic trees, mostly for shade and beautiful flowers and things that are very ornamental, but very little that was used. Like the Indian side would have mango and tamarind and jackfruit, and the British side would have the rain tree and the tabubuyas and beautiful flowers, but not native and not used in daily life. The next slide. And then we come to 2015, and you can see that there's only one lake in the heart of the city. The rest of the lakes survive in the periphery, but in the heart, all you have is one lake, and that lake, Alsoor Lake, is half of the size. Trees continued to be planted, but by about 2000 onwards, we started losing hundreds of thousands of trees for various infrastructure projects. So we have now this paradox of the city that is growing very fast, facing climate change, but absolutely no attention given to ecological infrastructure because trees are being cut and lakes are being destroyed. The next slide. So as the city got pipewater, lakes and wells became polluted. As the city got hotter, this is in the 19th century, trees were planted. But what happened is a shift. Even now, when we protect the lakes or plant trees, there was a shift in the way people related to nature. As the British colonial regime came in, from an Indian way of thinking of ecosystem to a multifunctional ecosystem use, like I described, the fish, the weeds, the foraging, the agriculture, the sacred use, towards a purely recreational focus or environmental support and ornamental plants. The next slide. So for instance, lakes were used in diverse ways. Livestock was washed and watered. Clothes was washed by the professional launderers called dhobis. Women migrant workers washed the clothes in water. Women foraged at this lake. People worshipped at the lake. Like I said, there were lake goddess worship every year when the lake overflowed. And now, the next slide. These lakes have now become, the village forests they've been converted into degraded waste dumps or public utilities or gated parks. This is the conversion that we have. So they're either degraded and polluted, or they converted into these gated parks, often ticketed, so someone needs money to enter, or they have specific timings and you're not allowed to access them during the day. And you're certainly not allowed to access them for fishing or swimming or any other ways of regular use. Next slide. So this is how the rejuvenated lakes look now with the gates, and children who used to play can't play anymore. It's more for bird watching or recreation or jogging or walking. The next slide. Then it's not just the lakes that have changed, it's the cities and the trees that have changed in the way we think of ecosystems. For instance, this is KR Road, one of the largest roads in the city. It used to have wooded streets with vibrant street life. We talked to old street vendors who used to live there. In fact, there was a bamboo weaver colony, which is very well known in this landscape. They used to live on the side of the road, very iconic part of Bangalore. And they used to use so this is a ficus species, and they would use the sap of the species and mix it with one of the millets, the ragi millet, of the night before, and swallow that first thing in the morning. And that, they say, would ward off coughs and colds. Right? So there were multiple uses, a lot of biodiversity in these areas. And now cars have increased. Yeah, next slide. Trees have been cut down. So it's become a high-speed road with very few trees. The trees that are there are ornamental, and the street vendors, whom you can see in the few blue tents, are being resettled because they've lost any capacity to stay without the trees. Trees were very important for basic things like privacy. For instance, the women would change their clothes behind the trees. And without the trees to protect them, they have no way to actually stay in privacy. So lots of little things that we found that the street vendors have their lives so intimately bound with the trees in global south cities. And this is not something anyone ever thinks of when they actually cut down trees on the road. What happens to the vendors? And the vendors are very important, on the other hand, for city dwellers for privacy, because women who come back late at night, when the city is deserted and you feel isolated and there's a likelihood of high crime, if there are street vendors living there, especially families living there, that woman walking on the street feels very safe because not much can happen to her because there are families on the street at night. Right? But this is not something policymakers think of. It's not just there. If you look at the gardens, so here's an example of the botanical gardens, which Hyder built. Lal Bagh, they were botanical gardens, but they had a lot of fruit and ornamental trees. There were also orchards. But now they have become these landscaped gardens. The next slide. Purely recreational, all exotic trees, nothing that is grown that is useful. And again, it's used, it's also extremely water guzzling because a tree park doesn't require so much water, but what this requires is groundwater is pumped, used in tankers and brought to irrigate these lawns, which are very American type lawns, which require a lot of pesticides, herbicides, water, which is ridiculous in summer of the Indian context, right? The next slide. And this also extends into private spaces. So this was a typical Bangalore bungalow. Rich home garden, you can see all these creepers on the front, and these were beans that were grown, they were eaten, flowers that are used for worship on the left, you would see the pink flowers that are used for worship, many plants that are cooked, eaten, used for worship, used for medicines, very rich biodiversity, very high in native species. But now what you find is many of these houses give way to apartments. And the next slide. Apartments have manicured lawns, ornamental plants, coconuts are given way to royal palms, right? And people don't, again, you have the kinds of lawns with the kind of grass that you need to maintain a lot of spray, lots of pesticides, lots of herbicides, lots of water, and no knowledge of indigenous species because the knowledge also goes away. The next slide. Where do you find the last refugees or the original Indian ethos in the city? In fact, in informal settlements and slums, because they have the highest proportion of local species and the highest proportion of useful species. In comparison, if you looked at parks, 80% of the trees in parks are exotic. 70% of the plants in slums, you don't find too many trees in slums because there's not much place. But in paint buckets and battery cans and old plastic sacks and whatever they have at hand, they are growing useful species, which are medicinal plants, which are endemic, which are local, which are high in biodiversity, right? So they are actually the custodians of biodiversity. And the next slide. And then sacred spaces, mosques, churches, temples, graveyards, all faiths have their own species and they're very different species, but all faiths are nature very important. Sacred nature is very important. So you have people feeding ants and birds and protecting roosting sites, and they're very resilient places. This is a Nandi, which is, there's a spring that comes through the mouth of the Nandi, and this entire place was actually buried in Malleshwaram, in a part of Bangalore, and it was going to be built up. And then someone saw that it was always wet and dug in and found this is the origin of one of the springs, which is supposed to feed the Arkavati. Right? So this is just an example with the pigeons, but there are many others of sacred spaces. And sacred spaces, again, have very high biodiversity, which is research of our own that we've shown this. The next slide. So now what can be done? I'm leaving you with a lot of negatives. I should want to leave you with one positive, that what happens in the periphery of the city when water has been a scarce resource is that communities have been coming together to protect water and revive these lakes. Because in the periphery of the city, all hope is not lost because development is now happening and these lakes can be protected. So one of the lakes, Kaikondali Lake, that I was a part of the lake revival along with a large group, was like this when we started in 2006 and 7. And the next slide. It then was restored and maintained by a collaboration between the citizens and the BBMP, which is the municipality. And the next slide. And we now have over 120 species of birds. And Eleanor Ostrom, who won the Economics Nobel Prize, whom I worked with for many years, came shortly before she passed away and planted a jackfruit tree at the site to recognize community efforts through her tree planting. Right? So this is a very well-known lake because of its efforts. And this is the lake after restoration. Yeah, the next one. It's a pocket, it's an oasis in the heart of the city where, like I said, there are over 120 species of birds. And it's really in a very, very dense part of the city. So it really makes a difference in making the city, the wells in the city more recharged. It provides groundwater. The next. We also found, we did a study with a number of restored lakes, and we looked at about 100 different visitors and users of these lakes. And we found that lakes are very important for place making. See, what global south cities have is a lot of migrants. And when migrants come in, when do they start feeling the city is their own and then start contributing to city urban movements of revival? We found that people come to the lake. It could be a child of the lake, a mother of a differently abled child, a corporate employee, a worker, someone who's transgender. Each of them have a different connection. So transgender people said they like to sit in front of the lake because anywhere in the city, the police show them away. But in front of the lake doesn't judge them. A mother of a differently abled child said that her child comes to one of the lakes to expend energy in the morning and he gets calmer. He feels happy at the lake. She's happy, he's happy, and then he goes to school. And she says, if I don't bring him to the lake, the day is a disaster for the two of us. Corporate employees who work in an IT company the whole day and they're going to be there most of the evening and night too. They come for a break, they bring a flask of tea, they settle down at the lake for half an hour, mental stress relief, and then they go back, right? And the migrant workers that you see above, they're climate refugees from a different part of the state. But they come, they take a pay cut to work at this lake because just like us, their child is with them most of the day and they want the child to grow up in a healthy environment. And if they work in, like say, the building site just opposite where they earn more money, that means the child is in a more dangerous environment and it's breathing all that smoke and dust. And so they would rather have the child grow up in the kind of nature that they grew up in the village, right? So you have the idea that this lake inspires placemaking, and when people meet at the lake, you get to know your neighbors in a fragmented city. And from these meetings at the lake have begun traffic movements to help government school education, movements for waste management, movements for all kinds, of urban sustainability movements have sprung up because people have met at the lake, started feeling this is my place, and taken on environmental stewardship. So this is the new ecological wisdom. While I talked about the old ecological wisdom that is fading away, lakes are still important to restore for a new ecological wisdom. The next slide. And this is something we need to think of because we have bans on urban foraging and we're now viewing these lakes as pure recreational sites where flower plucking is prohibited, damaging plants and trees is prohibited, swimming is prohibited, bringing pets is prohibited, everything that you can think of is prohibited. But the next slide. What we've seen in a recent study of ours is we looked at 200 women from low-income houses, and they knew about 76 different species of wild plants that they foraged or bought. There was a peri-urban gradient. The highest foraging was in the periphery of the city, and only 2% foraged in the city center, but they still went to a local market. They told a woman in the local market what species they wanted, and she would forage in the periphery and bring it back for them the next week. So there's this healthy exchange in forage species going on across the city. And they know about all of these different species, which we don't know about at all. And they know the medicinal uses. This is good for the brain. This is good for the stomach. So indigenous knowledge is massive in these areas. The next slide. It's not just food security. Therefore, it gives you local medicine, nutrition, and traditional knowledge that is passed on through generations that we are completely forgetting in these global south cities with the expansion. The next slide. And so we had for instance, and we looked at this, it's not just in India, but we looked at this study, which is in cities across the world, and we find whether it's Philadelphia or New Orleans or cities in Europe, Stockholm, urban foraging is not legal. It's not defined as legal. Because it's never defined as illegal, but it's not defined as legal. And what that means is the way planners, because it's not talked about at all, people don't think of foraging. And in all of these cities, we find Philadelphia, New Orleans, Stockholm, India, South African cities. Foraging is widespread. It doesn't matter whether it's global south or global north. But because it's not defined as legal, most of the foragers are always policed, either put into jail or fined or excluded from foraging. So foraging is always on the margins. It's always being done in the dark in fear of discovery. It's a power game. Marginalized get very affected. And it's just because nobody thinks of foraging, nobody thinks of ecology as wild ecology in the city. They only think of parks as areas of recreation. Nobody thinks of abandoned plots or wood lots or the grass at the verge of the streets as something that is also ecology. The next slide. So here's just a bit of, there's 68% people foraging in cities in South Africa, 47% people forage in cities in Uganda. So it's not just the global South. In New York City parks, we have foraging. More than 75% of the foraging in Philadelphia is in parks. In Stockholm, mushroom foraging and harvesting of berries is very important. And another paper in Berlin talks about 15 different species foraged as food and teas and medicinal herbs. Yet, most city authorities currently frame urban foraging either as an illegal or an undesirable activity. The next slide. So I'll wrap up by saying we need ecologically smart cities. And this is a beautiful slide by an intern, Rohit Rao, who was the one then an undergraduate student who was working on the group that did the foraging research. And this is really an ecologically smart city, which would work in a global South context where you have place for the pigs and the cows, as well as the man with the pram and the man with the cart taking his grass home, the woman foraging, the women selling, the street vendors, the people, the IT workers, the lakes, the parks, everything. It has space for everything. And this is really the global South city. This is the reality of the global South city. So unless we actually think of it this way, we're not going to manage it purely through infrastructure and IT. We have to manage it as ecologically smart cities and pay attention to the way in which nature is used in the cities. The next slide. Yeah, and this is some more of the work that we have, nature in the city, cities and canopies. Next slide. So many leaves, chasing Sopu, where have all our Gundatopes gone, different publications of ours, and all of these are available on the Azimut University website. Shades of Blues, another new paper of ours, a new book of ours. Next slide. Yeah. One thing that we found that scientists need to communicate this to policymakers, and sometimes we fail within the city because we've been talking to municipality which is really focused on infrastructure. But we looked at Gundatopes, which are wooded groves, and we wrote a little story, which is a bilingual story in Kannada and English, which is illustrated by our students. And then it turned out that the Panchayat Raj, which works with villages, wanted 6,400 copies for students across rural libraries. But then they issued a government circular that you can see on the right side, which is in Kannada, which essentially says that every village must rejuvenate its wooded groves, which is huge impact. So it's one thing that we realize that we need to be out there communicating a lot of this research. In fact, academics who are doing research on cities, often this stays, and if one stakeholder in the government is not open, there's always another stakeholder who's very open. So for instance, we've been very successful with working with the municipality on lake revival. Not so successful with working with them on tree protection, but we've been very successful in peri-urban areas working on tree protection. So one needs to engage with stakeholders of various kinds, especially the government. And there are always going to be a lot of government officials who are very open to collaboration. And I think academics need to do a lot of co-production with government officers, we're also working with corporate groups, with citizen groups, with resident welfare associations, and we run a number of courses. And this kind of co-production is very important to actually think of sustainable cities. We can't let our research only sit in papers. Right, the next slide. Yeah. So I'll just wrap up saying nature in cities has witnessed rapid change from brown and dusty to blue and green and now gray. But what we see is in urban commons like informal settlements, lakes and sacred spaces, that's where nature thrives. And the idea of nature as a node of environmentalism and placemaking takes us forward to modern cities where you have migration. And this shows us a path forward for ecologically smart cities, which can become nodes of new urban commons. And the science then needs to be taken forward to urban planning and planners. So I'll close here and would be happy to take questions.